My name is Erica Dick. I'm a board member with Catarina, and I'm very pleased to be part of this panel, to be moderating this panel that is today. We are going to hear a presentation from Jean Langdon, and let me just grab the title here. Sorry, multiple screens going on. We're going to half a century of research, and I'm very excited to hear this presentation today and to help moderate the question and answers. Before passing over the screen or virtual platform to Jean, I'm going to tell you a little bit about her. Jean finished her Ph.D. at Tulane University in 1974, and she is the coordinator of the National Institute of Research in Brazil, Plural, IBP. She is a retired full professor in the graduate program in anthropology at the Federal University of Santa Catarina in 2004, and she continues there as an advisor and a voluntary professor. One of her lifelong themes in research has been the ritual use of yajé, if I'm pronouncing that correctly, among the Siona indigenous peoples and its role in the maintenance of collective well-being. Besides her recently published doctorate, which is on the Cosmopolitics among the Siona, Shamanism, Medicine, and Family on the Putumayo River in 2017, she is the author of numerous articles related to the politics and poetics of the yajé experience. Retirement has enabled her to return regularly to the Putumayo for collaborative research and participation in contemporary and to observe the transformations of Siona shamanism in a response to decades of armed violence and capitalistic exploitation of their territory. Jean, we're really honored to have you present with us today, and I'm going to turn it over to you now.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here, to be with, looking at the program, many young people from different fields, representing different ethnic groups, and a pleasure to be trying to share with you a little bit of what my title is about, a half a century of shamanism. Originally, I thought I had a little bit more time, but with the time limits I have, I'm just going to be able to pinpoint a little bit about my experience with the Siona. I can't talk to you about my experience with ayahuasca and sacred plants in Brazil, and the Guarani Indians, as well as the New Age religious groups, the ayahuasca religious groups. So I'll have to concentrate on the Siona. I've worked with them for over 50 years. I started in 1970. And there are a few points a few characteristics I want to make about this last half century to pose at least two questions for discussion when I finish speaking. I think it might be interesting to think about. There are three tendencies that surround the use of sacred plants, and in my case, yajé, or which is known also as ayahuasca, or botanically is known as made out of different species of the genus Banisteriopsis. One of these is the extraordinary expansion of ayahuasca. I never would have imagined in 1970 on the Putumayo River that ayahuasca would have become a major sacred plant in use in the 21st century. The second aspect I want to point out is the impact of the expansion of ayahuasca and other sacred plants on our thinking about reality. And in that, I'm speaking both of scientific thinking about reality and also about spiritual thinking. In terms of science, which is more my field, we often call this perspectivism, in the sense that we acknowledge that there are different ways of knowing and there are different perspectives on reality. In philosophy, it's called perspectival philosophy. But this has had a major influence, I think, on part of what I'm going to try to say and what I want to discuss at the end. And the final aspect, which has to do with this perspective on reality, has to do with the radical changes in what neurobiologists and others call set and setting. The impact of the group, the impact of the context on what we know, what we see, what we perceive, when we are, in fact, taking a sacred, drinking a sacred substance such as ayahuasca. And today, of course, you know, and I don't need to really talk about it at all, but that ayahuasca today is used in many different kinds of ways. Science is working with it to see what are the medicinal properties of the plant itself. Psychologists use it for therapy. Religious groups use it as inspiration. Tourists go after it. Ayahuasca, in that sense, or yajé, has become a commodity. It's become an attraction to tourists. And what I want to talk about really is my own experience with ayahuasca that began in Colombia. Now I'm going to try to share. What I'm going to do is talk and share some of these pictures with you that represent my time with just to give a little bit of situate a little bit my own research. It is with yajé, the Colombian version or the Colombian name for ayahuasca, which that is much more commonly known, I think, by most people. It is a plant that was studied by the ethnobotanist of Richard Schultes, who in fact visited the indigenous communities that I'm going to talk about. It also is related to William Burroughs, the poet William Burroughs, who went through Puerto Asís in the Putumayo, which is one of the locations where I have done research, and wrote the Yajé letters in the 1950s to Allen Ginsberg. The Yajé letters is a book that represents a correspondence between the two. This is also the region that Michael Harner, he was not in the Putumayo itself, he was in Ecuador, but Michael Harner in the 1960s, early 1960s, studied ayahuasca, the use of ayahuasca among the Jivaru Indians. And Michael Harner, as many of you must know, became later a pioneer in the establishment of workshops on the way of the shaman. He's the one who coined shamanic state of consciousness. And it's interesting, he researched many anthropological works on shamanic practices. As we know, they're found all over the world in order to create techniques for his workshops. One of the most interesting things about Michael Harner is that in spite of the fact that he talks about his experience with ayahuasca, he in fact developed a whole series of practices that don't use substances, but rather are with drumming, with darkness, with seclusion, with abstinence. He basically chooses a series of other techniques to develop his shamanic state of consciousness. And this, of course, is an important thing for us to remember, that it is not necessary to have a substance to enter into a shamanic state of consciousness. And finally, the region I study was also studied by Michael Taussig. After I finished my research, I actually introduced Michael Taussig to some of the shamans of the lower Putumayo, in which he is one of the earliest anthropologists to look at the impact of the relationship between the state and shamanic practices and shamanic beliefs. And Michael Taussig was also one of the first anthropologists to say very clearly, shamanism and shamans are Western inventions, in the sense that we have developed our ideas about shamanism as universal categories without much diversity. I'm not negating that shamanism doesn't exist. I am not assuming the role that is simply a figment of our imagination. I believe that shamanism is speaking about the term shamanism, which is a Western term, is speaking about a phenomena that involves both a perspective on the universe as well as ritual practices that reveal other realities. And so shamanic practices also are a historical and cultural phenomena in the sense that this capacity to enter into alter visions of the world, to enter into alter realities, to know alter beings that extends to the entire New World and very possibly came from Siberia, has historical and cultural continuity, although one must remember there is extreme diversity. When we speak of shamanism, when we speak of shamans as the leaders, we must always remember that there is extreme diversity. And so we're not talking about a universal alter world. We're not talking about universal figures of shamans, but in fact, both the category of shamanism is a dialogical category in which different peoples have come together over the last 30 years to present, to dialogue and exchange ideas about what these practices are and what this phenomena is. And this is going to be one of the issues that I want to get at when I talk about the changes of the Siona. There's been my history then, to start with my history. In 1970, I go to the Putumayo, the highland valley of Sibundoy in the Putumayo, to do work on the Sibundoy medical diagnoses. I was working with a medical team. As I said, Schultes had passed through this valley before, and a couple of years before I went, a man named Melvin Bristol had spent a year with the Sibundoy studying their use of yajé and Banisteriopsis, as well as doctorate, and also some other plants that they employed. He was followed then by another anthropologist, Ide Sejas, and finally myself, that began to have discourse with the different Sibundoy shamans. This is Salvador. He's a Kamsa shaman in the highland Sibundoy Valley that was one of the collaborators with Schultes and with Melvin Bristol, and collaborated with me. And he was one of the Sibundoy shamans that stimulated me to travel to the lowland Putumayo. This is because the Sibundoy shamans were a part of a circuit of what I call curanderismo. It was a circuit, an ancient circuit of shamanism that had origins in the lowland Putumayo, in the lowland Amazonia, and went all the way up into the highlands, taken the substance of ayahuasca as well as their practices into the highlands. It's the pre-colonial circuit, but when colonialism comes, the shamanic practices are incorporated into the popular medical circuit. So you find the Sibundoy shamans traveling all the way through Colombia, taking ayahuasca, selling their wares in the markets, and treating patients in markets in different locales to cure them of their illnesses. It's the Sibundoy shamans that visited Puerto Tejado, a village in the sugarcane region of the Cauca Valley where Michael Tausig was working. And when he first became interested in this network between shamans, ayahuasca, and popular medicine, which also includes witchcraft. So as a result of my experience working with these Sibundoy shamans, I took off down on the Putumayo River, because the Sibundoy shamans said that their origins of learning how to be shamans, that they studied under the indigenous groups of the lower Putumayo, including the Cofan, the Inganos, and the Siona. I chose the Siona because of a recommendation of Scott Robinson, who had worked with the Cofan, and said to me, the Siona are very important. They have deep shamanic knowledge. And in spite of the fact that they use aluminum pans and dress in Western clothes, their heads are still very indigenous. The Siona shamans were actually by the 1970s quite well known in both ethnographic works, or documented, I should say. Their knowledge was documented in ethnographic works as well as missionary diaries. There is strong evidence that they were practicing in the 16th century when the Jesuits first came into the region, which would indicate that in fact This is an ancient practice among them. By the time we get to the 20th century with the rubber boom, the Siona shamans are known as cacique curacas, which is to say shaman leaders. And the Siona are dispersed into small villages that are led by these shaman leaders and their alliances. They were famous for taking yajé. Everybody, the missionaries often drank with them. The anthropologists, the few anthropologists came down, also drank with them. And they're still doing ritual curing up through the 1960s. In the 1960s, the last of what I'm going to call the master shamans, because I'm going to make a distinction between shaman and master shaman following Siona distinctions. The last of the master shamans, the cacique curacas, the shaman leaders of the villages, all died in what the Siona call the Great Shamanic Battle. And all died in the sense of reciprocating witchcraft among each other and causing them all to die off, leaving the Siona in the 1970s when I arrived in the situation we call shamanism without shamans. What I mean by shamanism without shamans is talking about people that still have a shamanic perspective of the universe, a perspective that the universe is populated by a series of non-human beings, that these non-human beings are associated with animals, with features of the landscape, with plants, with other levels of the heavens. And that in order for us to have well-being, the human must negotiate with these beings for good hunting, for good fishing, for good agriculture. And the shaman among the Siona, the curaca, as he was called in the 1970s, was responsible for this. So when I was among the Siona in the 1970s and recording shamanic narratives, I heard lots of laments about the loss of their master shamans. The Ricardo, who you just saw here, had been expected to take over the role of his brother when his brother died. But in fact, he had a series of bad visions, and the entire community stopped conducting their own ceremonies, their own shamanic ceremonies. When they had to drink yajé in order to find a lost child, or order to cure cure some sort of illness that was considered to be caused by witchcraft or some invisible cause, they then went to shamans of other groups, including Salvador, a Cofan Mestizo shaman that was part of this circuit that led up to the Sibundoy Valley and then beyond to the cities of Colombia. The Siona, in spite of the fact that they were not leading their own ceremonies, had several men who were considered to be delicate, several elders who had learned shamanic practices, had journeyed to the other realms of the universe. And I discovered that all of the Siona, the young and the elders, had a very strong identity between their knowledge of shamanism and their the particular knowledge of shamanism in this network. They distinguished themselves by their own pinta, which would be the visions that they saw, the different domains that they traveled to. And these domains, basically, you would go to a shaman and ask, please show me your pinta, and he would take you to a specific domain. It could be the sun, the domain of the sun, the domain of the moon, the domain of the jaguar people, the domain of the anaconda, or any of the other peoples of the universe. And to know a domain, a specific domain and its spirits, you needed to know the designs that these particular invisible beings had, so that their yajé designs were painted on their objects. They were also painted on their face. These are examples of Ricardo, who was one of the few people who painted his faces. Here you've got the jaguar people and the yajé people. These were designs he saw when he went to their houses, to their locations in the universe. Here, when he went to see the moon people, the other are the flamingo people who live on the moon that are very beautiful people. There are some examples of these geometric designs, because these geometric designs are extremely characteristic of much of the indigenous art that reflects the other realities, the other worlds. They don't draw a representational art, but in fact are doing geometric designs. But as I said, in 1970, there were no Siona shamans, and the petroleum was beginning to be extracted in the Putumayo, including one of their ancient territories, and they were so quickly getting drawn into the national economy that I predicted that Siona shamanism would disappear if there wouldn't be for some sort of messianic movement that would perhaps revise it. Actually, I was quite far wrong, which is a wonderful thing to be wrong about your predictions, and which is probably one of the advantages of living as long as I have to see these changes. But in fact, what we have is that the Pacho, this man you saw in the other picture, and here you see him again, was responsible for an important shamanic revitalization. And this shamanic revitalization was, he began in the late 1970s to drink yajé with his brother. And then he began to incorporate into a network that was not only the curanderismo shamanic network that the Sibundoy were part of, but also a new network that was between Amazonian shamans and urban professionals who were wanting to drink yajé. They had, in Colombia, they call these tomos de yajé. They were led by journalists, they were led by psychologists, they were led by others. And in the early years of these tomos de yajé, the Amazonian Indians would be invited to come and to bring the yajé and to administer the yajé. And so Taita Pacho became an extremely important figure. All of his sons also became shamans. And I found at the same time that most of the generation of young men that were young men in the 1970s also became shamans, attending to these professional groups, these urban groups that were looking for self-awareness, that were not looking for curing of witchcraft, but looking for self-awareness. They also began to have non-governmental organizations, became interested in them. Here you have Taita Pacho at the encounter of the Yajiceros, which was organized by an indigenous organization as well as by a non-indigenous organization. This is a picture taken from a wall in a bank in Puerto Asís, the location where many years before, William Burroughs had been rolled on the banks of the Putumayo when he was in a drunken or drug stupor of Taita Pacho. It's in homage to him because Taita Pacho, in fact, became not only an important indigenous Siona shaman, but he became an important figure, public figure, representing an aspect of the Putumayo that the tourist agencies saw as a selling point for the Putumayo, the drinking of yajé. And here are some other pictures of the current shamans in 2014. I didn't go back to the Putumayo for 20 years. 1992 was my last trip. It was a period in which indigenous peoples, the new Constitution of Colombia had announced, had been ratified, which involved finally the recognition of indigenous peoples as citizens. It had granted them their right to traditional authority, as well as their right to self-determination on their indigenous lands. Interestingly enough, traditional authorities in the general conception of the Constitution and the general conception of the Colombian public, as well as the indigenous people, refers to their shamans. Here we have Filito, who was a good collaborator with me in the 1970s, preparing yajé for a community meeting in which they were going to have an assembly. We have Juan Yaiguaji, who was another good friend of mine, and his wife back in the 1970s, now living in Macoa because of the violence in the region between the guerrillas and paramilitaries and the drug traffickers. He, along with many different Siona, left Putumayo, left Buena Vista. And in fact, because of this violence in the region, the Siona are considered to be culturally and physically at risk because of the deaths, because of the incredible domination, the control that the guerrillas at times, or the paramilitaries at times have had of their community in Buena Vista. At the same time, the positive aspect, in spite of the violence, here you have a Maloka. The Siona are participating now with their own Malokas in the Putumayo, in which hundreds of people come, non-indigenous people come to drink yajé with them. And finally, and more importantly, is that the Taitas, the shamans, the men who identify themselves as shamans, who drink yajé, have become also resumed a political role. The community is not guided by a cacique curaca, but in fact is guided by an alliance between the shamans, who lead communal yajé ceremonies to deliberate important community decisions, and the Cabildo government, which is an elected government. It is a kind of government that was instituted by the 1992 Constitution, in which they are expected to, they are elected leaders, the governor, the treasurer, the secretary, and other members of the Cabildo. And so what you have is a resuming not only of the ritual aspects of the taking of yajé, but also a resuming of an alliance, a political role. It's not the same as it was, but it is a political role in the sense that they are closely allied, and any major decision that the community has to take, such as when Buena Vista was asked if the petroleum company could extract oil on their territory, they had yajé ceremonies in which the shamans drank yajé to consult the spirits, to consult the other beings of the environment, and gave a negative no, arguing that in defense of their environment, the invisible beings did not want to have the oil extracted, that it was polluting and that it ruined their own landscape. These are very quickly to go through some of the current. Humberto's my compadre. He was a good friend in the 1970s. He's now one of the elder, last of the living of the current Taitas. There's been quite a number of deaths in the last 2 years, of these important Taitas, of these elder men that are basically my age. And so he's one of the few that's left, but we do have young apprentices training. This is a picture done by one of the Taitas that represents Siona identity. It's an interesting picture in the sense of if you look and see what are the aspects of their culture that they want to highlight. And here you've got the yajé, you've got the jaguar, the shaman that used to change into the jaguar. They don't anymore, they say. You've got the anaconda. They used to change into anacondas. They don't anymore, according to what they say. They also say that they don't do any more witchcraft, which I'm not really quite sure of, because I have heard a lot of gossip among them when they often will accuse a different shaman of doing evil. But the public figure of the shaman today is the community guardian, who is a person of love, who is a person of peace, who is an ecological native, as they call themselves. You can see with these pictures too, some of the paintings on the Maloka, where they drink yajé in the Buena Vista community. These paintings are not done by the Siona as the old geometric paintings that I showed you in the past, but in fact were done by a non-indigenous artist that spent some time apprenticing with Umberto, who's sitting there in the hammock. One of the interesting things about this picture, when you want to think about shamanism as a dialogical category, is this particular figure of the Madonna, the indigenous Madonna with child. And this is one of the aspects of the changes in Siona ceremonies as they have moved in and attended to non-indigenous populations, as they have become much more part of this indigenous curanderismo circuit. Catholic aspects, Catholic symbolism and aspects of the ritual have been incorporated into the yajé rituals that they have with the community. So they begin normally with the Lord's Prayer, which was kind of a shock to me the first time that I went back and started drinking with them again. But after the taking of the yajé, then they do go into their shamanic chants, except that with the loss of language, many of the new yajé practitioners, the new taitas that are very young, don't know the language. And so you're getting not only an artistic change, as you can see here, you're getting a language change, singing changes in the singing, and you're also getting changes in the ritual, which is added to the fact that today these rituals are done with large groups of people. I participated in one ritual that had 200 people in Buena Vista. It was the inauguration of a Maloca, and it included many people that were Umberto's people that drank yajé with Umberto in the highlands in Quito and Bogota. It included 2 non-governmental organizations, one that calls itself the Spirit Siona and is introducing other music into the Siona community as legitimate music. Finally, they also are in constant contact with the whole new ayahuasquero context, the new shamanism context, in which the government, this is an example of a governmental sponsored event that included the Siona shamans, included the Sibundoy, included yajé ayahuasca from Brazil, from Santo Daime, included peyote, included all sorts of other substances. So the shamans have moved into a new world that has different art, that has a different language, and that has different concepts. So I hear today the Siona using such terms such as Pachamama, Mother Earth, talking of love, in spite of the fact that in the old days they didn't talk of love, but they certainly had a very strong sense of communal collectivity, of the necessity of living in harmony with the universe. And I wanted to return then to my final idea, or the suggestion that I'd like us maybe to talk a little bit about, is to go back to think about, when we think about shaman and shamanisms, we need to think about diversity. We need to think about many different ways of learning about the universe, of learning about the world. If we think about shamanisms as a technique of consciousness, I'm not calling them archaic techniques of consciousness, as would Eliade, because they're not archaic, because shamanism is dynamic, and these knowledge systems are dynamic in spite of the fact they do have an underlying perspective of the world that breaks with binomial categories, such as shamanism and shamanism. And I think I want to stop here. I think that's the end of my talk. But the real idea is that how can we talk about shamanism and shamans without categorizing them, without having expectations about what we think they are, so that we can indeed open to the potentialities of what the shamanic experience the shamanic perspective via sacred plants can offer us.
Thank you so much, Jean. You've given us so much to think about. And I want to remind you and everyone here that you can meet in the connection room as well, because there are lots of questions, and I'm certain that we will not exhaust this topic in the next few minutes. You've sort of anticipated some of the questions in the final stages of your talk here, and so I'm going to ask the questions in the order that they've been. Felix Uhl asks, as shamans from around the world and from around the Amazon and beyond converse more and more with scientists, like, for example, in this conference, sorry, it's jumping on my screen. How do shamanic practices and cosmologies change? You've already touched upon this a little bit, but I wonder if you want to say anything else specifically about that interaction with scientists.
I've actually, one of my greatest interests has been, and much specifically with the Siona, although I've accompanied the Guarani as they have interacted, has been as how do these cosmologies change as you change set and setting? Because set and setting does impact upon what the experience is about. I can't say with scientists because I don't know of any. I mean, I haven't really participated with any scientists' work, excluding the fact that I know that they're interested in how set and setting impacts. And one of the things I can say that I find just so heartening is that the Siona shamans, there was a Siona session of drinking yajé a year ago with Taita Pacho. You saw him in one of these slides, in which he explained to the small group, there were less outsiders, it was mostly Siona that were present. He explained to the small group how he entered into contact with the cicada people who were responsible for the rains of August, and how he calmed the rain, and how the jaguars came, and how they looked and talked about the absence of the dead shamans. It was a very interesting vision that he told about, because it was so much like what I had listened about in terms of visions of the 1970s. And that's when you get to the issue I'm trying to say, is it is these unconscious worlds. The world is an infinite world, is an expanding world, but there are ways that people know about it. I can't answer the question. Sorry.
That's all right.
That's all right.
There are many questions.
Here.
This one comes from Carmen Everall, who says that she's participated in a ceremony led by a shaman in the Colombian jungle. There were 180 people, sounds similar to the one you attended with 200, and she couldn't let herself go due to the size of the group. What are your thoughts? And again, you've touched on this a little bit, but what are your thoughts on the size of the group and versus individual practice?
Well, I have a hard time with large groups. I mean, I think to be able to give in to the experience, to surrender to the experience and go through the experience, you need to have confidence and intimacy with whom you're taking it. And I think in that sense, but it's not true for everybody else, but for me it is.
Wonderful. I'm going to keep going with questions because there are so many here that I want to try to squeeze in as many as we can. Cregan, who asks, how can Westerners participate and learn from shamanistic traditions without becoming literalistic and dogmatically adopting the cosmology of another culture? How do you, sorry, it keeps jumping. How do you find this balance?
And that's, I guess that's one of the points I was trying to make. Because I have a gut reaction against stereotypes. I remember when I came to Brazil and a young girl says to me, I'm a shaman because I drank ayahuasca. And it's some of the pictures, it's some of the discussions. But I think that in the end, if you think about shamanism as a technique of consciousness, as one of the many paths, and there are many other paths for us to explore our consciousness, I think that within it, what happens within an indigenous setting is in fact, one can explore their consciousness, but then in fact, it's not going to be separated from the context and necessarily those souls, if I can use that idea, with whom they're in association at that particular ritual. So I think you have to be very careful of not expecting of your expectations, and you have to be very careful of binomial thinking.
Thank you for that answer. Sarah Barbosa asks, what would be your suggestions to empower the elders and strengthen tradition, understanding the complex socio-political situation that Colombia goes through?
Oh, I would say that these elders, Siona elders, understand it perfectly. They're dealing with, I've had a series of interviews with them. They're dealing with the violence that they're facing. The real issue is not that. The real issue is that in spite of their powers, these domination powers, the land grabbing, the dishonest actions of the petroleum companies, the problem of poverty as they integrate into the economy are so great. And I'm not in that, I don't know the solution to that. I can't believe that they've had to go through 500 years of so much domination.
Can I ask you to elaborate a little bit on what we might do outside of Colombia to help empower those elders?
I think
support
that
them maybe.
Well, no, support them, but the thing is that you have to realize that they are agents. They are, and what I find with the Siona shamans, which the ones I know are the ones that maintain a root in their communities. I mean, you do have some that have left, and they're considered by the communities to be commercial shamans. But the ones that have kept their lines in the communities, they are in contact with NGOs that are working with them. And it's not just the expansion of ayahuasca shamanism, but they're in contact and drinking yajé for being able to justify the expansion to ancestral lands that they were robbed of. I think that how can we empower them? We have to. I'm trying to do that with my return of ethnographic material, in the sense that let them know it exists and they're capable of learning what to do with it. The real issue is that there are many, many forces against them.
Yeah. I'm going to try to squeeze in a couple more questions. There's one from Osiris Romero who asks, would you explain why categories as shamans and shamanism could be considered Western frameworks, which covers diversity? I agree that it would be useful to reflect about it from a decolonial approach.
I wasn't speaking of shamanism and shamans as categories that cover diversity, but rather as a categorical thinking, classifying. And this probably has a lot to do with it. When I started working on shamanism, people were still talking about what are shamans? How do we define shamans? Are they schizophrenic? Are they witches? Are they, this whole search of a Western mind trying to understand, in fact, a perspective that doesn't fit in to our categories. I did a study on the 18 different varieties of yajé that the Siona shamans recognize. And Richard Schulte said that, there were only 2 species of yajé. There weren't all these other species that the Siona recognized, because the Siona are their experience of knowing different varieties is very, very different than based on a botanical categorization. So that's when I'm talking about categories as binomial thinking. That's what I'm thinking when we put people and their roles into categories.
That's really instructive. I've got another question here that, again, it relates a little bit from Holly Flammer. How do South American shamans feel about yajé being used outside of their context of set and setting?
Well, I think that Well, I can only talk about this. Well, I can talk about others, yeah, because you have a lot of the South American Indians, particularly in Brazil, that, you know, Brazil is a very different country than Colombia in the sense that the indigenous Amazon is a long ways away. I live in southern Brazil, and we're now tons of indigenous practitioners in the Brazilian cities. I think it depends on. I think it depends. What I find among the Siona is that when the person doesn't also communicate in the community rituals and the deliberations, that they tend to feel that is shame and it's too commercial. But if they are there also participating and drinking for the Siona and not just for the tourists and not just for their clients, then I think that they feel, I don't think they have problems with it. They shouldn't. It's a way of surviving.
I apologize. I'm watching the time, and I know we have about 4 minutes left, so I'm going to try to sneak another question in. I'm actually moderating the next session in another room, so I unfortunately will have to leave. Apologies to all the people attending. This question, perhaps the last one from Marcus Mars. He asks, or he says rather, I haven't tried yajé yet because of the group setting. Is it traditionally also experienced with simply one guide? How is it different from DMT, which was my first psychedelic experience? And thank you.
Oh, I can't tell you. I think the difference with DMT and drinking yajé probably depends very much not only on the substance but on the setting. I can't answer that question. My feeling is that smaller groups and preparation, which includes the diet and other things, are much better ways of taking yajé than, you know, dropping into large, you know, sessions periodically.
I want to thank you profusely for this really enriching conversation and just such a wide diversity of ideas about yajé and shamanism and Western ideas. I'm giving you a clap that I know that everybody else is joining me in their ways. You'll have to imagine that in person. And thank you very much